The win, I'm gonna do the best that I can. So there once was this guy named Bob Eddy. Actually, he still exists, but he had a cattle farm here out in Mina, and the overhead costs to raise cattle is quite significant, and the return is actually not that great. So Bob Eddy had this idea that he wanted to start a lobster farm. You can raise lobster for relatively cheap, and he actually had some warm springs on his property where he could raise the lobster. Hello everyone, my name is Diane and this is Out and About with Diane, where I like to explore, travel, camp, basically do anything outdoors. And in today's adventure, I'm in a small town of Mina. There's really no services. There's one restaurant, but there used to be two restaurants. And the restaurant that I'm going to cover today is the Desert Lobster Cafe. It used to be Nevada's only lobster farm, and it was right here in Mina until the Nevada Department of Wildlife came in and shut down the operation. So that's what this story is about today, and I'm going to bring you along, and I hope that you find some of this information useful. And I want to know what your opinions are down in the comments, so make sure to leave your opinions. Alright, let's get started with the video. The win, I'm going to do the best that I can. So there once was this guy named Bob Eddy. Actually, he still exists, but he had a cattle farm here out in Mina, and the overhead costs to raise cattle is quite significant, and the return is actually not that great. So Bob Eddy had this idea that he wanted to start a lobster farm. You can raise lobster for relatively cheap, and he actually had some warm springs on his property where he could raise the lobster. Lobster that Bob Eddy raised were Australian blue freshwater lobster, and after some research I actually found out that they actually weren't lobster, they were crawfish, but they're significantly larger than the crawfish that we see here in the United States. This right here used to be Bob's lobster farm. It didn't always look like this, but one day the Nevada Department of Wildlife came in and took all of his lobsters and cut up all of his plumbing for the operation. They dumped the lobsters out into the desert, and then they bleached the tanks. When I drove by this, I knew that this had to be the lobster farm. I mean, look at all the PVC pipe over there, and I did see pictures that looked like this. And then I found these warm springs when I was driving by that are directly across and right next to the property. So this had to have been where he raised the crawfish. And I did hear stories about people who were driving over all of these lobsters or crayfish across the highway, and I think that this was the spot where they were raised. Bob had quite the operation going on. He eventually opened a restaurant called the Desert Lobster Cafe, where you could have a nice lobster meal, or you could buy fresh lobster / crayfish and you could cook them yourself. But this posed a problem with the Nevada Department of Wildlife, because the crawfish are an invasive species, so I'm sure that that's why they came in, but he also didn't have the proper permitting. However, in Bob's defense, he did try to get the proper permitting, but he was denied with every avenue that he wanted to take. I actually feel really bad for Bob because he sold his cattle farm to raise these freshwater lobsters, and his whole dreams were actually ripped apart. And there's several articles about this, that this story was covered all over the United States, and it's really just unfortunate, and I'd really love to know what your opinions are. The boat is still standing there, and I can't help but think of a time where this was such a happy place where people could stop and have a nice dinner, because this area of Nevada is very remote, so I can imagine that this gave people something to look forward to on that lonely drive down the 95. Anyways, that's the story about Bob Eddy's lobster farm. Isn't it so sad? It looks like he probably still lives in this boat, or somebody else bought it and they're living in it. I tried to get as much footage as I can, while being respectful. But that is the lobster story out here in Mina. What are your opinions? Leave them down below. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. Yeah, just a man's dream, just torn to shambles. And it was very recent too, you know, only in 2003, so really it wasn't that long ago. It just seems like it was a story from like ages ago, and it wasn't. So, yeah, I have really been intrigued about that story. I heard the story, or I read the story a long time ago on a Facebook group, and I've seen it more than once about how these lobsters were crossing the road on the way from Reno to Vegas. And I would tell people this story, but I never did any research until recently, and I was doing this road trip, so I thought I'd cover this in a video. I thought it was really interesting. So, like I said, leave your opinions in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next video. All right, bye.